tremendous progress with only a few sticking points. President Trump says a Russia-Ukraine peace deal is on the horizon. But is it? Ukraine's red lines remain and Russia is refusing to budge on its war goals. So what progress has been made? And what should Ukraine give up in return for peace? I'm Melinda Nusafora, and this is Counterpoints. The effective end of its existence as an independent country, or its only pathway to peace. A deal originally drafted by the US and Russia has backed Ukraine into a corner. If it agrees to the terms, it risks its sovereignty and major public backlash. If it doesn't agree, the war continues and it risks losing US support.
I think we're getting very close to a deal. We'll find out. I thought that one would have been gone quicker. We did 8. I thought that would have been an easier one, but I think we're making progress.
The revised peace plan has reportedly reached consensus on most of the points, except the ones that really matter, the really contentious ones, the points requiring Ukraine to cede territory to Russia, dramatically reduce the size of its military and agree to never join NATO. Classifying these as merely a few sticking points seems like an understatement.
As long as Russia has not taken real steps toward demobilization, real steps to shut down its war machine, steps that would clearly show that Russia is serious about ending this war of aggression, we do not have the right to stop working to support Ukraine.
So coming up on this episode, we'll debate if a Ukraine peace deal really is imminent. What does an acceptable compromise look like? And has the recent corruption scandal weakened Zelensky's hand? Stay with us. Joining us for this discussion is Dr. Alexander Merezhko, a Ukrainian MP who heads the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament. Brandon Weichert is back with us, Senior National Security Editor at The National Interest and author of A Disaster of Our Own Making, How the West Lost Ukraine. And rounding out our panel, Sir Michael Fallon, a former British Secretary of State for Defence between 2014 and 2017. Gentlemen, welcome to Counterpoints. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, the US has been very open about pursuing what it calls an aggressive timeline to secure a deal between Russia and Ukraine. US President Donald Trump had initially said he wanted Ukraine's Zelenskyy to sign on by Thanksgiving, but he's since walked back from that particular deadline. He does, however, remain optimistic. Alexander, let's put it to you first. Is a deal imminent?
Well, unfortunately, I would like to say yes, but on the basis of the previous experience, I have to be really skeptical about this. And besides, we know that for President Trump, deadlines not always work. So he's very flexible with all kinds of deadlines.
He is very flexible with deadlines. Brandon, do you think that is a sign that maybe the president isn't as confident that a deal is imminent as he had made out in the days previously?
I think the president very badly wants a deal. I think the president's problem is he's dealing with a bureaucracy in Washington that is not totally under his control. I think he has a Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is sort of out there calling audibles every time he gets out of the country. That's complicating things. And I think that he has a lot of factors, such as Ukrainian input, which is causing complications because obviously Zelenskyy doesn't agree with the 28-point plan. There's now a 19-point plan that apparently the Ukrainians have floated as an alternative that Marco Rubio is running with. So there is no consensus here. There is no stasis in the argument. So in my opinion, I don't think we're going to be getting a deal anytime soon, unfortunately, although I do believe Trump wants it.
He can want it all he wants, so Michael, can't he? But what do you think? Do you agree? We've got two quite pessimistic outlooks there.
Well, I'm not as pessimistic. Actually, if it hadn't been for President Trump, I don't think we'd be anywhere near a deal at the moment. His predecessor didn't know how to end this war. The Europeans don't know how to end this war. I mean, what the president is doing, and timetable may well slip. It's already slipped, as you pointed out. It may well slip. But what he is impressing on everybody is that this war has to end at some point. And at the moment, Ukraine simply can't win this war. It's always been true that Ukraine could lose, but Ukraine can't win. If the United States aren't prepared to support Ukraine indefinitely, if the Europeans are going to go on buying Russian oil and gas and not supplying Ukraine with the weapons it's needed for so long, then Ukraine can't actually win this war. And I think President Trump has put his finger on it. There has to be some kind of negotiated ceasefire. And, the quicker that is done, the better.
Dr. Mereshko, what do you make of Sir Michael's comments there? Can Ukraine not win this war?
To quote one famous politician, yes, we can. Yes, we can. To win this war, it's winnable, but it depends on the support of the West, or the whole Western world, including the United States, because each time when Ukraine displays creativity, like Operation Spiderweb, for example, we have success. And what's going on right now? Russia has bogged down in the territory of Ukraine. According to some estimates, for example, for Russia to occupy the rest of the Donetsk Oblast only will take 5 years and several millions of casualties on the Russian side. So we can win the war, but again, it depends on the support, especially, such long-range missiles like Tomahawks, for example, and all kinds of sophisticated advanced weaponry.
Exactly. But given those weapons are not being supplied, and they should have been, of course, you're right. They should have been supplied. They should have been supplied very much earlier in this conflict. I only wish now we'd given Ukraine the weapons it needed back in 2014 to resist this aggression in the Donbass. But we decided collectively, Obama, Merkel, the British government, we decided collectively not to do that. And I don't think you can go backwards. I still don't think, without the support that you recognize is needed from outside, I don't see how Ukraine can actually regain the territory it's lost. And therefore, we have to have some kind of compromise.
Yeah, they can't regain the territory. And I disagree, though, respectfully, that we should have been giving weapons, tomahawks and whatnot. That is not the way we should have been doing this. We should have been negotiating a settlement. The Minsk Accords were the way to go, and we messed that one up. And the Ukrainians are now paying the price for it. And it's very unfortunate because the Ukrainians do not need to be getting slaughtered this way. The war should have been over years ago, at the very least 2 years ago during the Istanbul conference, but that is the way it goes. So we do need to now stop talking about resupplying. The United States, as I have said for many, many years now, the United States is depleting its critical stockpiles of weapons. And now we have what looks like to be some major operation off the coast of Venezuela. It looks like there's something kicking up between Japan and China, which will undoubtedly rope the United States in. There is no way we can afford, with those limited stockpiles of weapons, to be able to be sending all of that over to Ukraine while we're doing all these other things. We have to pick a front, and the Russian front is not the primary front.
I understand that, but that's why I think we now need, to stop the killing, to actually focus on what kind of ceasefire would give Ukraine some kind of peace and some kind of security. Clearly, it's not ideal. Clearly, it will never reflect the courage and the heroism of the Ukrainian forces. We can never do that. We can't set the clock back. But what we can do, I think, is focus all our efforts on making sure that there really is a security guarantee for any ceasefire, at least as strong as Ukraine being inside NATO, that Ukraine keeps a substantial military force to resist any further incursions, and that any territory that it does give up, it gives up de facto rather than de jure. There's no lasting surrender of that territory, and that one day Ukraine, just as Germany, or hopefully one day Korea, can be reunited with the territory it's lost.
Well, what you're talking about, though, is not a peace then. You're talking about a ceasefire. And I don't think that's what most Americans would support. I think we want a peace deal. And so I don't believe we should be leaving the door open. Trump is out of office in 35 months. What's to stop the next American president from restarting hostilities with the Russians over Ukraine again? We don't want to have a security guarantee because our security guarantees, frankly, have exacerbated this crisis much more than it already has been. So in my opinion, I agree we need to get a deal. I agree that we need to stop the killing right now. I'm with you on that. And I think the president is as well. But in my view, we do not need to be doing any deal that leaves the door open for some, ambiguous open-ended date where we're going to go back into conflict with the Russians. The Russians have been very clear, and we've been on panels together with Russian representatives where they've been consistently clear. They don't want this open-ended thing, so they're not even going to come to the table, really, if we start talking about we're going to give security guarantees and we're going to leave the door open for the Ukrainians at some point to take back land. That part of the war is over, and unfortunately, in my opinion, the Russians have won. And so we need to move on now and save what's left of Ukraine.
I don't think we're that far apart, but I would like to hear from Alexander on this.
Yeah,
yes.
Let's bring in Dr. Mereshko. How do you feel, particularly with a suggestion from Brandon that perhaps this frontier is no longer the US's priorities, considering it has other issues on its doorstep that the president is now turning his attention to? If that's the case, is this the best deal Ukraine is going to get? In which case, should it take it?
Well, first of all, it makes sense to negotiate with someone when you are sure that you can reach a result and this person will comply with the reached compromise or reached agreement. But this is exactly not the case with Putin. He had violated all possible agreements, including Minsk Accords, including Budapest Memorandum, including bilateral treaty, respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. So it makes absolutely no sense to even to negotiate with Putin because he will never comply with the reached agreement. It makes no sense. Second, with regard to security guarantees, we had this and continue to have these security guarantees from the United States. It's called the Budapest Memorandum. We had given up our the only deterrent factor, our nuclear arsenal, one of the biggest in the world. And we hope that the United States will do everything to prevent Russia from attacking us. So what kind of lesson other countries should learn from this? So that they should have their own nuclear arsenal like North Korea or to do something else. Finally, I believe in the United States. I don't think that United States is a weak country. It's a giant in terms of economic power, in terms of military industrial complex. I don't believe that the United States doesn't have, it's so weak, supposedly, that it doesn't have enough weaponry to share with Ukraine. I just don't believe in this.
Well, unfortunately, that we are depleting significant stockpiles and we are unable to replenish them. In a related bit of news, the U.S. Navy has finally canceled the Constellation-class frigate after billions and billions of dollars spent on it. It's just one of many examples of how things are not going the way they should be in the American defense industrial base. And I think Ukraine and the rest of the world needs to get very, very realistic here about what Uncle Sam can do truly for them, rather than relying on the sweet, siren song that politicians in Washington send their way. The fact of the matter is the Americans are at the end of our logistical rope, and we cannot continue this war. It is a miracle that we've been able to do what we've been able to do, given all the crises. And I would just add, in my personal opinion, in 1994, the giving up of those nukes was the single greatest mistake Ukraine ever made. That was a significant leverage point. They basically sold out their national sovereignty to Bill Clinton, who was never serious about actually upholding the promises he made. He was only trying to buy time for himself. Clinton was a short-term thinker, and it was very clear that was a short-term solution to a headache he was dealing with between Ukraine and Russia, Boris Yeltsin at the time. So in my opinion, the great mistake and the lesson to be learned is if you have nuclear weapons, don't give them up. You cannot give them up. That is your shield.
Yes.
And in the case of Ukraine and America, America should have been using its technical proficiency to shore up that nuclear weapons arsenal in Ukraine to make sure the Ukrainians had a viable access and control over those weapons rather than pulling them out and giving the Russians that opening. So.
Probably. But,
I have a question for you as a specialist on security issues. Are you suggesting that the United States should rectify this mistake made by the United States? Because at that time, Clinton's administration put pressure on Ukraine to give up our nuclear arsenal. Maybe the United States should give back us at least technical nuclear weaponry.
Unfortunately now that cannot happen because the Ukraine state is too unstable right now. It cannot happen. It can't happen.
Both of you, with respect, both of you are now going backwards, and I understand why. I think we've got to face the reality, the real world today. The United States is not going to commit much more weaponry to this fight if Ukraine can't win it, and the Russians are not going to retreat from the Donbass. Therefore, there has to be, sadly, some kind of ceasefire agreement. And the issue, Alexander's rightly raised it, can we devise some form of security guarantee, one that Brandon probably doesn't like, but can we devise some kind of security guarantee that does give Ukraine a better assurance?
Neutrality is the only security guarantee.
Or from Minsk. And secondly, can we ensure that Ukraine retains enough of its military to be able to prevent further incursions in the southeast of its country? That's what we should now be focusing on, facing the real world and seeing what kind of ceasefire might possibly hold. Not going to be easy. That's why they're still locked away in different hotel rooms in different cities trying to work it out.
You're correct. Yes, in principle, you are correct. But the problem we're facing now is at the tactical level. And I think this is very key to keep in mind. And I'm not dismissing the heroism of the Ukrainian frontline troop at all. But the fact of the matter is, at the tactical level, the Russians have the advantages. And the 2023 offensive that was planned by U.S. generals, by the way, it was a disaster for Ukraine against Russia, and it did more damage to Ukraine's ability to hold out than it helped. And so we are now in a position where we want to negotiate. We have to negotiate. But the Russians don't necessarily have to negotiate because they hold all the cards on the ground right now. And at some point, the Ukrainians are not going to be able to hold out. So when we talk about getting a deal and the Russians say root causes, we all know what that means. When the Russians say root causes, we're going to have to meet them at the table and be willing to discuss the root causes because we don't have the leverage anymore that we had, say, in April of 2022.
Well, I think we ought to be more positive than that. You're still going backwards.
I'm a realist. I don't live in positive or negatives. I just accept the reality as it is.
I think we can be positive. Look at other wars that have ended. Look even at the war between North Korea and South Korea. Okay, the country was split in two. Look at South Korea now. An incredibly strong country with a lot of inward investment and a big economic power in the world. Ukraine could be that, even with some portion of its territory, like Korea or Finland, some portion of its territory temporarily lost for a few years. Ukraine, with a lot of inward investment.
Well, South Korea and North Korea is permanently
Ukraine
lost
could
to South
easily
Korea.
be a great European country.
Hold on. I understand your example of Korea, but I think it's important to remember North Korea is permanently lost to South Korea, and no South Korean I know is talking about reclaiming the Yalu River or Pyongyang. They're two separate countries now, which is what I think would be best for Ukraine. And it sounds like the Russians, outside of that eastern portion and the Crimean region, the Russians are willing to let the western portion of Ukraine go its own way. It's the NATO types that keep insisting on this completely irrational strategy of doubling down on failure. And so, in my opinion, you want to do a North Korea, South Korea model, fine, but we have to acknowledge South Korea is not trying to take North Korea, and North Korea, it sounds like lately, isn't even really interested in taking South Korea anymore. They're doing their own thing. So
what I meant in the long term, Brandon, in the long term, freedom will out. When I started in politics, half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain, was living under the Soviet Union. Country by country, those countries became free, joined the European Union, joined NATO, and became democracies. You must never write this off. But
Look,
for now,
I understand what you're saying.
Ukraine now
Okay.
has an
Blew it
opportunity.
after 91.
Finish. Ukraine now has an opportunity. If we all get in now, invest in the rest of Ukraine, Ukraine's economy can modernize, it retains some military force, and it can become a great European country with the support of the world community. And we can only do that if we build outwards from a ceasefire.
All right, I want to bring in, before we need to move on to our next segment, Dr. Mareshko, give me your opinion on what you're hearing there, the prospect of being divided in a North-South Korea sort of sense. I also want to ask you if you can answer this as well. The feeling from you, from Ukraine, about whether the US remains a just, a viable, a legitimate mediator here, after we've heard these reports showing US Special Envoy Witkoff coaching Russian negotiators on how to get on the good side of President Trump. Does that negate the US's role as a legitimate mediator here?
Well, first of all, I don't view the United States as a mediator. I view as our ally and as our friend. Despite some,
But does a friend work against you in favor of your enemy?
No. Well, if you look, for example, at opinion polls in the United States, majority of Americans, both Republicans and Democrats, support Ukraine. And they understand that Russia presents huge danger for American security. I hope they understand that Russia is waging war not only against Ukraine, it's waging, in the final analysis, the war against the United States, against US-led rules-based order. And it's important to remember this fact. But I have a practical suggestion. When we're talking about security guarantees for Ukraine, the best security guarantee for us is NATO membership. So the only thing the United States can do as the leader in NATO, just to admit Ukraine to NATO. And I assure you, it will stop Putin, it will stop Russian aggression against Ukraine. Because Putin, yes, he is a bully, but he is a coward. He is afraid he cannot handle Ukraine. He is he is losing the war. And this is the truth. Ukraine is not losing. Putin, Russia is losing the war. And we can see it. But the best solution, of course, is NATO membership, the most practical and the most reasonable. Just we need political will on the part of the United States.
What about the concept of Ukraine being permanently divided, like South Korea, North Korea? Is that an acceptable concept?
It's ludicrous. Russia should be divided, and I hope this empire will collapse into a new states like Ichkeria, Chechnya, like Tatarstan. It's inevitable. It's an empire which will collapse. The whole history of Russia is a history of collapse of empire. So it's inevitable. It's just new historical cycle. As for Ukraine, you will see that I don't know when it will happen, but we will restore our territorial integrity. Sooner or later, it's inevitable.
I'm going to move us on to our next segment, and then I'll get you responses to that as we move on. This age-old adage that we hear all the time, there are no winners in war, seems very relevant in this conflict, especially as it grinds on towards 4 years without major victories on either side for so long now. So both sides have a very bitter pill to swallow. And then more broadly, Europe in turn has suffered through energy and cost of living crises and now faces the extra economic burden of boosting defence spending as, just as Brandon was saying about the US, their depletion of armaments continues as well. US Vice President J.D. Vance wrote on social media, "There is a fantasy that if we just give more money, more weapons and more sanctions, victory is at hand." Brandon, is he right? Is it a fantasy that continued US and European support for Ukraine equals victory?
He is correct that continued U.S. support is complicating the ability for Ukraine to get a favorable deal. Vice President Vance is correct that our aid and our supplying of Ukraine has exacerbated this. And this connects back to what Alexander was saying earlier. The Russians have said for years, And maybe they're all lying. I don't know. But the Russians have always said root causes. And when they say root causes, that's synonymous with NATO expansion. Now, we all might think, who cares? It's not a big deal. It's just that's a peaceful thing that's going on. But to the Russians, this was always a very significant red line. Mikhail Gorbachev warned about this in his final year. Boris Yeltsin, who was probably the most pro-American leader of Russia ever, was warning Bill Clinton about this. And of course, Vladimir Putin has been, vetching about this for a while. So we're talking now about the U.S. through NATO continuing to supply and eventually absorbing at least part of Ukraine into NATO. I don't understand how people believe that that is a shield against the Russians. It is not. It will only demand from the Russians that they militate further against Ukraine and eventually against the rest of Europe. The way out of this is to not absorb Ukraine into NATO and to live up to the principle of the Budapest Memorandum, which first and foremost enshrined Ukrainian sovereignty plus neutrality. And we have violated that. And so root causes are a condition for Russian rapprochement. And so far, the Europeans seem I understand Ukrainians not liking to talk about this. I get it. And I empathize with them. But ultimately, we got to be the big boys in the room, and we're going to have to not talk about Ukrainian entry into NATO, and we're going to have to cut this thing off, not only because America has bigger fish to fry, but because we're making the situation worse for Ukrainian people.
Dr. Marechko, what do you think about that?
Neutrality in the Budapest Memorandum, I never heard. I read it many times. I didn't find neutrality for Ukraine in the Budapest Memorandum.
The Russians did not sign that thinking that Ukraine was going to join NATO, sir. The Russians would have never signed that. Okay, this is the problem.
I cannot read minds. I don't know what
I understand you can't read minds, but the bottom line is that Ukraine constantly flirting with NATO is the reason why this war is happening the way it is. That is 100% why. And we need to accept this. And all the people obsessed with expanding NATO, and you mentioned earlier this plan to collapse Russia, and I've heard it from the people at Hudson Institute my entire career. I've heard it from the neocons in Washington. My entire career I've heard this, and it sounds as nutty now as it did then. Frankly, collapsing a nuclear-armed state the way you're talking about in Russia will create a nightmare scenario. We barely avoided that in the 90s, thanks to the Nunn-Lugar Amendment. You're talking about now basically encouraging this, and I guess Ukraine being used as a vehicle for that. That is a very dangerous supposition, and that is not something the American people support, and it's certainly not something that the President of the United States will ever support.
Well, look, we've got to be realistic
about the root causes. There is only one root cause, and this is crime of aggression committed by Russia against Ukraine.
Yeah, they shouldn't have invaded you. I agree. That is wrong.
Of international
I get
law.
it.
As for NATO membership, why Putin doesn't want Ukraine to be in NATO? For only one reason, because Ukraine and NATO doesn't help him to kill Ukraine. That's the only reason. And this is exactly the reason why we want to be in NATO. This is the only guarantee of our survival. It is the only thing which can prevent Putin from erasing us from the map of the earth and subjugating the country and the nation. That's the only reason. Other countries, like small countries like Estonia, Latvia, they're safe just because they're members of NATO. We also want to be safe when we have this maniac as our neighbor.
Mm-hmm. All right,
okay,
so Michael?
Look, if we've learned one thing, 4 years of this dreadful war, and indeed since the invasion of Crimea, is that Russia is never going to allow Ukraine to join NATO in anything like the near future. And therefore, we have to be absolutely realistic about this. There are no winners from this war, as you said. And if the US is not going to supply and can't spare the weapons that you need, and if Europe is not able to wean itself off Russian oil and gas and supply the weapons you need, then nobody is going to win this war. And that means we have got to search for a proper ceasefire that has some element of security, not as perfect as NATO membership, but some element which the president has already conceded the United States may in some form be willing to provide. Some element of security backed up by the Europeans that at least give Ukraine the prospect of living beyond a ceasefire with no further invasion of its territory. And that, coupled with retention of a large military force, an awful lot of Western investment, I think should be what the Ukrainians can now get out of this particular process. But we can't go back to Budapest. We can't go back to the original invasion of Crimea. Yes, Ukraine has been betrayed, but we have to move forward now and find a peaceful settlement.
If we're talking about compromises, Donald Trump was asked what compromises Russia will have to make in this. And he responded by saying to stop fighting and not take more land. It's not really a huge compromise when you consider what the deal is asking Ukraine to give up. So, Michael, isn't this just going to send the message then that might is right? If you're tough enough, you can kind of take whatever you want and the US is going to let you do it?
You've got to look, I think, at what Russia really wanted. Russia wanted the whole of Ukraine. Russia wanted to change the government of Ukraine. It thought it'd be in Kyiv in weeks. Thanks to the bravery of the Ukrainians, that has not happened. So Russia will be deprived of that aim. It has not been able to conquer Ukraine and restore it inside the Soviet Union. Secondly, Russia wanted to demilitarize Ukraine. You see now in the proposals that are being floated, Ukraine will be able, under the plan that's being put forward, to retain a sizable military force. And thirdly, I hope you will see that Ukraine will not have to cede these territories de jure forever, that there will be a ceasefire and they will be temporarily conceding that Russian occupation of those bits of the Donbass that they occupy at the moment. So, Russia, having set out nearly 4 years ago, has lost hundreds of thousands of its troops, has been humiliated as a military machine in the eyes of the world by the Ukrainian army, and has not gained its principal prize, which was to conquer Ukraine, bring it back in the Russian orbit, and install a Russia-friendly government in Kyiv.
So, Dr. Mereshko, should you take that as a win and maybe then there is compromise to be had?
Well, if we allow aggressor not to be punished to get away with the crime, but to be rewarded with territorial concessions, then the whole world, global security is in big trouble. It creates very dangerous precedent for China, for other potential aggressors. Aggressors should be defined as simple as that. The whole civilized life is based on several principles. One of them is a principle of international law, sovereign equality. We don't dictate Russia whether to be or not in one defense alliance. Russia has its own defense alliance, and we never were against this. Why should they dictate us to which international organizations to join or not? Another principle is the principle of non-use of force. Again, if we violate this principle or allow someone to be rewarded for the violation, it will take us back in the 19th century. We shouldn't allow this to happen. It's a matter for the whole humanity.
There are, of course, implications
from this. Should be stopped by all of us.
Sure, but of course there will be implications, and there will be encouragement from other countries that start crossing borders, of course. But the plain fact of the matter is that 3/4 of the United Nations did not condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, would not support us, despite all our efforts to rally the international community. The international support was not there. Now, yes, there are implications, and yes, we've got to be very clear in future how we defend democracies. They can't all be inside NATO. Taiwan's not in NATO. Georgia's not in NATO. But we've got to think harder after this about how we defend countries that are free and democratic, but are outside the NATO club. And we've got to find a better way of doing that.
I think the entire assumption that people can rely upon international law has always been a flawed assumption. Does make right. This is the Westphalian state model. It is anarchic by nature, and this is why the countries that can seek their security through maximum policies, this is what they do. And this is what the United States does. We did it in Iraq. Anybody who talks about international law needs to really understand that the United States violated international law then. We should never have been in Iraq, and we did that, and that was because we could. And it's the same thing the Russians are saying now. And this is just the way the world works, especially now where there is a multipolar system, or at least a tripolar system. And unfortunately, these appeals to international law don't really help the situation at all, because nobody's paying attention to international law. And that's just the way it is. And as for these, these notions about, Ukraine can reclaim territory, they can't. And they haven't been able to. The Russians have held on to their part of Ukraine that they have held on to for over a decade. We've now spilled a lot of blood, spent a lot of money, sent a lot of weapons over there, and it really hasn't fundamentally shifted the paradigm at the tactical level. And we're now getting to a point where Ukraine is running out of money and Ukraine is running low on troops. And I disagree with these casualty figures that were being bandied about. We have to be very careful with those numbers, because both the Russians and the Ukrainians are manipulating the numbers. And I don't think we have an accurate read at all. And as for why Trump is talking about giving, so little in return, or getting so little in return from Russia, with the original question, it's very simple. He's finally, I think, being given the briefing that, people like me have been trying to get in to brief these guys on. And I think he finally got it. And he saw that the Russians have all of the advantages right now on the ground. And we don't have the ability anymore to change that without seriously escalating. And that's not in anybody's interest here. An escalation of the kind that's being discussed, wherein Ukraine is given some kind of guarantee, either NATO or otherwise, that will lead to a much larger war, and that destroys the smaller state, no matter who wins that. And I don't think I think the objective here should be to preserve Ukraine as best we can, and that has got to be the lodestar here.
So, Michael, I want to put to you the prospect that perhaps if the US does decide that these negotiations are taking too long, it's no longer the US's priority, that this is going to land squarely on the UK and the EU's doorstep. One of the US's new lead negotiators, the Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, is an ally of Eurosceptic Vice President J.D. Vance. And let's not forget, Europe was left out of the original drafting of this deal anyway. Should Europe be worried that it's going to be the only ones left supporting the Ukraine here?
Well, Europe shouldn't resile from this. This responsibility is ours. It's on our continent. Europe should have stepped up a long time ago. Why are we constantly, begging the United States to get our fat out of the fire? Europe should have stepped up when the original invasion of Crimea took place. As I said, Hollande and Merkel and the British government, we should have helped to arm Ukraine then with the weapons that it wanted. We should have, pushed home on the Minsk agreement. We should have supplied the weapons Ukraine wanted, as I said earlier, much earlier, instead of dribbling them out. And we should have increased our own defence expenditure. And we should probably have, charted, I said, a better form of partnership with those countries that are actually outside NATO, so that they had some kind of cover. And we should now pick up the pieces. I think one of the reasons Putin invaded Crimea and the southeast of Ukraine is he saw the Europeans' heart wasn't really in Ukraine. We weren't investing in it. We didn't really consider it as a proper European country. We should accelerate Ukraine's membership now of the European Union. We should invest in Ukraine. We should do everything we can to grow a really strong economy there, a really successful society there after the war has come to a ceasefire. And we should, that should now be our investment. So yes, the responsibility should now fall on Europe and should have been taken up by Europe a long time ago.
If I can just pick you up on that. You were Defence Secretary, part of the governmental apparatus during the Crimea invasion and annexation. So when you say we should have, why didn't the government do it at the time?
Well, we lost the argument. I argued strongly that we should have supplied some of the weaponry that Ukraine wanted in the summer of 14. But it was a coalition government. The rest of the coalition was not in favour, and nobody was in favour. Obama wasn't in favour. Merkel wasn't in favour. Hollande wasn't. Nobody wanted to send arms down there. And I was told if we did that, we would provoke the Russians, to which I replied, the Russians were already there. It was far too late to consider that. But look, that was a mistake. And I think, people like John Kerry, who was involved, now recognise it probably was a mistake. That was the time, actually, to step up and to make clear to Putin that if he moved on from Crimea across the Donbass, then there would be repercussions. But Europe didn't do that, and we've simply got to do better next time. And that means, accelerating membership of the European Union for these weaker democracies on the edge of the European Union, getting them in, reviving their economies, investing in their infrastructure, and bringing them forward as fully fledged European nations.
Is entry to the European Union enough for Ukraine, Dr. Mereshko?
Yes, we're grateful for the support provided by the European Union. It's tremendously important, especially right now. But,
But is it enough without the US?
Well, of course, it would be much better if the United States would continue to provide us with weaponry. Yes, but right now Europe is ready to help us by financing buying weaponry from the United States. Sorry, by buying weaponry from the United States. I think it's a win-win situation for both Europe and the United States, because Europe understands that Ukraine is fighting for Europe. If we fail, Russia will reestablish its hegemony over Europe. And in the final analysis, the US will have to fight to send the boots on the ground, and the history will repeat itself. And the only guarantee against this is our fight. I don't know, I hear now and then these excuses that it's about escalation. To me, it's a myth about escalation. We already have full-fledged, full-scale escalation, or we don't have enough weaponry for you. We continue to fight for only one reason, because we know that if we stop fighting, we'll be finished. We'll be just exterminated. We'll stop to exist. We have no choice. It was not our choice. And we will continue to fight no matter what. We don't trust that Putin will agree to to spare us. We don't believe in this. And it's up to you, it's up to the Western world to decide whether you support us by providing help. We're not asking you to fight instead of us. We're not asking American troops to be on our ground, but you can do a lot. You can do a lot to help us to defeat Russia. It's very close. It's maybe even closer than you think. But you can do it, or you can just observe it, how we're fighting and bleeding. It's your choice.
Unfortunately,
Brandon?
I don't believe that the United States needs to be in a war with Russia, and I don't believe it's in my country's interests to view it the same way that the Ukrainians are viewing it. Yes, against Ukraine, the Russians have escalated. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It's not even a member of the EU. It is mind-boggling to most Americans, myself included, that we are somehow now going to have to risk actual escalation with a nuclear-armed power like Russia over Ukraine. It is not in our country's interest to do this. It's just not. I would recommend negotiate now and get a deal. Get a deal now. And in terms of, Ukraine joining the EU, that is certainly the prerogative of Kyiv. And if that's something that they believe will benefit their country, then good luck and God bless. But personally, I don't even think the EU is viable much longer. It's a spent economic force. I would be doing bilateral deals with Western countries rather than trying to get into the EU, which is just this gigantic bureaucratic mess. But that's just my personal opinion.
That could be a debate for another day, Brandon.
Of course it could. Yes,
we might pick up, and I can see
We're
Michael.
ready to continue this debate.
Sorry?
We're ready to continue this debate
Yeah.
as long as it takes.
And we will indeed. Now, we're almost out of time, so I want to move us on to our final segment when we look specifically at President Zelenskyy. This deal that's on the table asks more compromises of Ukraine than it does of Russia. And that puts President Zelenskyy in a very difficult position. How much of a compromise are the Ukrainian people willing to accept? And another complicating element for the president is the recent corruption scandal in Ukraine. His former business partner and 2 government ministers have been caught up in the bribery scheme. So, Dr. Mereshko, President Trump appeared to again question the legitimacy of Zelensky's presidency, putting leadership, the word leadership in inverted commas, in a Truth Social post. How damaging has this scandal been for President Zelensky and his ability to negotiate on the global stage?
Well, first of all, any scandal, including corruption scandal, is damaging in itself. We understand this. But you know, paradoxically, it's a proof that Ukraine is effective in fighting corruption. You know, you cannot imagine in, for example, authoritarian regimes in many countries when no one is above the law. In Ukraine, yes, we have truly independent anti-corruption, anti-graft agencies which bring to justice even ministers, members of parliament, and so on. And no one is above the law. So corruption scandals can happen, and they happen and will happen in democratic societies, unfortunately. But the key question is how you cope with these corruption scandals, how you fight corruption. And Ukraine gives example that we're effective in fighting corruption. And I hope that other countries will follow this example also. There is no cover-up, luckily. So, but of course, you know, our enemies will use this as an argument against Ukraine. But, you know, this corruption scandal is about kickbacks. It's worth emphasizing. It's not about stealing Western aid or American aid. It's not about it. Yeah, but we are determined to continue to fight against corruption for a very simple reason. It's in our best interests to do it.
So, Michael?
Well, look, you're right. There is corruption elsewhere, of course. There's a lot of corruption in Ukraine. There always has been. But there is corruption in a lot of countries. There's corruption in neighbouring countries. We've got a French president in jail for corruption. There might even be corruption in the United States. I have no idea. Brandon will enlighten us.
There is significant corruption. Yeah.
But maybe there is corruption there as well. It's how you deal with it. But let's come back to your question. All the pressure now clearly is going to be on President Zelensky. And he faces a pretty unenviable choice between coming to a ceasefire that involves some kind of surrender of territory, and he has to justify that to his people. But the alternative is to go on fighting a war that he simply can't win. Now, the problem, and Alexander was quite right, we have done a lot to help Ukraine not lose this war. Both Europe and the United States have poured in money, have poured in weapons, some of it too late, yes. But we've done only enough to stop Ukraine losing. What we've not been able to do is to assist Ukraine to win. Ukraine can't now win this war, can't get rid of all those Russian occupiers from the Donbass, and therefore President Zelensky, sadly, is going to have to come to some kind of compromise and then do the hardest thing of all, which is somehow to find a way of selling it to the Ukrainian people, in particular to the armed forces and those who've lost loved ones in the war itself. That's going to be pretty hard.
Dr. Mereshko, can the president sell it to the people? Can he sell this deal? Would accepting it be political suicide for Zelensky?
Yes, our people are determined that so-called red lines should never be crossed. I will just remind these red lines. They are in our constitution and in principles of international law. First of all, territorial integrity. Second, sovereignty. Third, our security guarantees. And actually talking about peace plans, I think we should return to a quite reasonable peace plan put forward by President Trump himself. I'm talking about his idea about unconditional ceasefire and after that starting negotiations. I think that's under the circumstances, that's the only reasonable plan. And we should return to this plan and to stick to it.
Brandon, do you think the timing of this peace proposal is a bit conspicuous? Is it that Russia is taking advantage of this corruption scandal, this potential to weaken Zelensky's position and using that for their advantage to curry favour with the US?
Well, they might be, but ultimately the fact of the matter is that the United States has a president who wants to do a deal. And they've been working on this pretty much since Trump got into office. So, I mean, the timing probably is, yes, being exploited by Moscow. But look, at the end of the day, the Russians really don't have to negotiate if they don't want to. So the fact of the matter is that we need to start coming to the table now, because I do think the reality on the ground is such that the Russians will start running the tables very soon if we don't get a deal. And I think the real reason that Putin is even coming to the table is because he wants to do business deals with the Americans to develop the rare earth minerals, for instance, in Russia. So this is sort of a, an olive branch. But ultimately, the Russians have the dominant position on the ground as of now, and that is not likely to change. And I would just like to push back. I'd just like to push back on the idea that the United States in particular wasn't giving enough aid over the years to the Ukrainians. I disagree, and I would remind everybody, notably, that the first Trump administration gave a lot of aid to the Ukrainians, and it's not enough, because you're going up against a juggernaut next door in Russia, and they're going to keep doubling down, and they've got the population base, and their economy is not as bad as everybody in the West is saying. They have been able to make that economy self-sufficient because of the rare earth mineral, natural gas, and oil resources there. They've been able to leverage that and build a war machine, and we're not. We haven't yet, and I doubt we will be able to soon build a war machine that can do what's going on in Ukraine.
So, Michael, do you think the corruption scandal that domestically has taken hold in Ukraine is weakening Zelensky's position, weakening his ability to be able to strongly negotiate a better deal for Ukraine?
Yes, probably, because obviously he's looking to his own future. He's looking to the difficulty of selling any agreement to the Ukrainian people. So it's obviously making it much tougher for him. But I don't think that gets you away from the fundamentals. Nobody else has a better plan than this. That there's got to be some kind of ceasefire agreement.
We are out of time, and we actually lost Dr. Mereshko just before we were about to wrap up. So I do apologise to him and to our audience for that connection issue. Obviously, electricity, internet, very temperamental in Ukraine, but we really do appreciate Dr. Alexander Mereshko's time here on the panel, Ukrainian MP who heads the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament, and to our two remaining guests. Thank you both for being with us here on Counterpoints. What a fascinating debate and a really interesting time for geopolitics. Brandon Weichert, Senior National Security Editor at the National Interest, and Sir Michael Fallon, former British Secretary of State for Defence between 2014 and 2017. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us on Counterpoints. And to you at home, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Counterpoints. To keep up to date with our latest interviews and debates, be sure to subscribe to Al Arabiya English on YouTube. And of course, follow us on X and TikTok. We'll see you next time.